I thought I would respond to some of the questions I have received about the, the crisis in Ukraine. So I organized the questions here, and I will give my opinions. Putin claims that Ukraine was never a country. Is that true? Well, yes, it is mostly. He is mostly right. At one point during the Middle Ages, Kiev was the capital of a kingdom that was probably the largest state in Europe. But that was really the beginning, the predecessor of Russia, because southern and eastern Ukraine were controlled by barbarians. There were Italian colonies along the Black Sea. Ukraine didn't really exist. After the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, the kingdom of Kiev basically dissolved, while in the north, a new kingdom was emerging, the kingdom of Moscow, that got bigger and bigger, and in 1547 was renamed Russia. The territory that is now Ukraine was occupied first by Lithuania, then by Poland, and these two countries eventually united. In 1654, the first major war between Russia and Poland was about Ukraine. Ukrainian aristocrats wanted to leave Poland, Lithuania, and join Russia. The result was that Ukraine was split between Poland, the western part of Ukraine, where the city of Lviv is, and Russia, eastern Ukraine, including Kiev. And so that's the source, the origin of the divisions that still haunt Ukraine. About 1 century later, Russia fought a series of wars against Poland that resulted in 3 partitions of Poland. Russia obtained almost all of Ukraine. A little piece went to the Austrian Empire. And basically Poland and Ukraine remained provinces of Russia until World War I. Ukraine was actually one of the causes of the World War I in 1914. The Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire were obviously the rivals in Eastern Europe, and each supported rebellions in the part of Ukraine that the other one owned. So World War I was started by the assassination of Serbian, of an Austrian aristocrat by a Serbian nationalist. But really the tension, the conflict had started in Ukraine. So anyway, Russia sided with Serbia, as did France and Britain, while Germany and the Ottoman Empire sided with Austria. In 1917, Russia went through the revolution and so got out of World War I. And so that's the time when Ukraine existed as an independent state. Between 1917 and 1922, it was a big mess. There was chaos. There was Lenin with the Bolsheviks trying to invade Ukraine from one side. Poland became independent. They also wanted a piece of Ukraine. Then there were the whites who were fighting Lenin's Reds. France invaded Odessa at one point. So there were many players vying for control of Ukraine. There was a government in Ukraine for a few years. Eventually, the communists won, and in 1922, Ukraine joined the Soviet Union, the newly formed Soviet Union under Lenin. And the good news is that Ukraine was recognized as an entity, although as a republic, in fact, although a member of the Soviet Union, so de facto still a province of Russia. Now, does that mean, so Putin is generally right that Ukraine pretty much never existed as an independent country. Does that mean that Ukraine does not have the right to exist? Well, that's a longer discussion. The Palestinians, the Tibetans, the Kurds, the people of Western Sahara. There are many people in the world that don't have their own country. Are they entitled to a country? Well, that's a thorny issue. Even the Catalans in Spain, there are many people who don't have a country and would like to have a country. So it's a long discussion. So anyway, and the fact that the country never existed is not a good argument for saying, oh, it should never exist. At the end of World War I, when the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire dissolved, a lot of new countries were invented. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Lebanon, even Iraq. When the Spanish Empire disintegrated in the 19th century, a lot of countries were created that never existed before, from Mexico to Argentina. When the British Empire collapsed after World War II, countries like Pakistan and most African countries were created, countries that never existed before. When the Dutch Empire collapsed in the 60s, Indonesia was created, a country that never existed before. I can go on. So Putin basically is saying that multi-ethnic colonial empires should not disintegrate, and that ethnic groups are not entitled to their own state. That's a different statement from saying Ukraine never existed before. Russia didn't exist before it was born. I mean, every country was born at some point or another. Now, in my opinion, Putin fundamentally does not understand Ukraine. He made a mistake in 2012 when he gave a speech in Kiev, during which he said Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. Well, given the history, Western Ukrainians certainly didn't like that statement. Maybe I exaggerate a little bit by like Germans saying Germans and Jews are the same people. Given the history, it's not an appropriate statement to make. Although there might be genetic, cultural, linguistic reasons to make some statements, but you know, it wasn't the best way to please the Ukrainian public. And 2 years later, there was a revolution in Ukraine that kicked out of power the pro-Russian president. Putin reacted by taking Crimea and basically taking Donbass, the northeastern part of Ukraine. And that was another mistake, because by doing so, he removed 4 million people, 4 million voters, well, 4 million people, which many are voters from Ukraine. And those voters probably of the pro-Russian current. So by doing so, he basically guaranteed that any democratic election of the future will not be pro-Russian. And now in 2022, Putin seems to have made another mistake in dealing with Ukraine. I don't know if he was really convinced that Ukraine would surrender right away and the people would welcome the Russians as liberators. By the way, I don't think the Ukrainians hate Russia. I have no evidence of that, except for some fringe militia. They do, quote unquote, hate Putin. That's a different story. And they're not the only ones who would rather not be ruled by Putin. So, you know, that, I mean, Italians federated with France and Austria and Germany, ancient rivals and enemies, when they were not afraid of the government. And I think Ukrainians and others would federate with Russia if they were not afraid of the government. So the problem is really Putin. If Putin truly wants Russia and Ukraine to unite, all he has to do is to resign. I think without Putin, things would be more peaceful, friendly, and easier relations between Russians and Ukrainians. Now, Putin claims that Crimea was always Russian and was given to Ukraine by the Soviet Union as just a technicality. Well, depends on when you start counting, of course. There was a Khanate, a remnant of the Mongol Empire in Crimea for a long time. Russia fought many wars, and eventually in 1783, Russia conquered Crimea. So if you start from 1783, then Putin is right. That was a contested annexation. In fact, in 1853, there was a famous war between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire over Crimea. So it's a famous war because, in a sense, it was a world war, since it involved almost all of the European powers. Crimea was populated by Tatars. The Tatars are, like the Mongols, are a Turkish-speaking ethnic group. And what Russia did after it annexed Crimea, Russia colonized Crimea. Russia sent Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, Poles to give them land and send them to colonize Crimea. The Tatars became a minority, and then Stalin, during World War II, deported 200,000 of them to Siberia. Anyway, since then, Crimea has been mostly ethnic Russian. And then in 1954, Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, gifted Crimea to Ukraine. So Putin is right that between 1783 and 1954, Crimea was Russian, and the people of Crimea are mostly ethnic Russians. Now, before we go to the next question, in my opinion, Ukraine is probably better off without Crimea. Ukraine has two big internal problems. One is the division between East and West. Western Ukraine is more European, it used to be Polish. Eastern European is ethnic Russian. This division has been there since Ukraine became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Without Crimea and without Donbass, Ukraine is actually way more pro-European than pro-Russian. So this could help heal the divisions within Ukraine. The other problem that Ukraine has is corruption, rampant corruption. The only state in Europe that is more corrupted than Ukraine is Russia. Not my opinion, just check whichever source you prefer on corruption in Europe. It turns out that many of these, so Zelensky was elected in 2019 because he promised to take care of corruption. There was actually, even in 2014, the revolution that deposed the pro-Russian president was really against corruption. So in 2019, Zelensky was elected because he promised to take care of corruption, but since then he has made very little progress. It's also easier to say that to do something against corruption, against oligarchs who are very rich and very powerful. Zelensky himself was helped by one of these oligarchs. In my opinion, the oligarchs, after this invasion, this Russian invasion, most of the Ukrainian oligarchs side with Zelensky for a simple reason. If Russia wins, if Russia conquers Ukraine and installs a puppet regime, the Russian oligarchs will take over. It will be Putin's mafia that takes the wealth of Ukraine. The same mafia that takes, that stole the wealth of Russia will steal the wealth of Ukraine, but that means the oligarchs of Ukraine will lose everything. So most of them are siding with Zelensky. And if and when this crisis ends, if it ends with Ukraine still independent, I think they will be much more malleable, much more willing to compromise with Zelensky, and maybe this will help reduce corruption in Ukraine. There's another point to make, that Crimea could backfire. The idea that Crimea deserves to be Russian could backfire against Putin. Why? Okay, if Crimea is mostly Russian, therefore, and it used to be Russian for a long time, therefore, it's right that Russia takes it. Then what about Karelia, which is a region that Russia stole from Finland? You apply the same logic, then Finland is entitled to Karelia. What about the Kuril Islands? They used to be Japanese. The Soviet Union took them, and they were Japanese for a long time. And what about what is now called Kaliningrad, the old German Königsberg? It's a little enclave, a little piece of territory next to Poland that was German for a long time. And should it be returned to Germany? So I think this could even backfire against Putin. This idea against, yeah, it's a logic that you could use against him. Now, next, Putin claims that the revolution 2014 in Ukraine was a coup. No, of course, it was not a coup. A coup is carried out by either the military or the police. There are guns involved. Here there were mass demonstrations. The military did absolutely nothing. The police actually attacked the demonstrators. So that's called a revolution. That's not a coup. The parliament, the elected parliament, democratically elected Parliament of Ukraine voted to remove Yanukovych, who was, I mispronounced it, Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian president of Ukraine. Yes, he was democratically elected, but he was removed by the parliament, and after mass demonstrations, there was no coup. He was replaced by elected members of parliament. Most of the people who took power, seized power, were Russian-speaking Ukrainians. The president who eventually was elected was Piero Poroshenko, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. So, I mean, it is true that the European Union had an agreement with Russia to keep Yanukovych in power, but the European Union does not control the Ukrainian people. So the Ukrainian people didn't want that president, and anything that the foreign diplomats tried to do, this is pointless. Okay. Putin complains that NATO repeatedly broke, its agreements with Russia. That's absolutely true. This started in the 90s. NATO, so the West claims that there was no written treaty between NATO and Russia promising not to enlarge NATO. There's a lot of documents written by left by the diplomats of the time, from which you can see that the West, NATO in particular, promised verbally to the Russians that there would be no enlargement of NATO in exchange for German reunification. So when those discussions went on, I believe it was 1990, the Western diplomats consistently told the Russians there would be no NATO expansion to the east. So it wasn't written, but there was that understanding. In 1997, Russia, the president was Yeltsin before Putin, gladly signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act in good faith. 2 years later, NATO admitted Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, 3 former satellites of the Soviet Union. In 2001, Putin was already president, and he helped the United States invade Afghanistan and sympathized with the United States that was attacked by Al-Qaeda. In 2002, Putin agreed to set up a joint consultative council with NATO. So there was good faith on the part of Russia. 2 years later, NATO underwent the largest expansion in its history, admitting 7 more Eastern European countries, including the 3 Baltic republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union. So Putin definitely learned not to trust the word of the United States. There were probably 2 main episodes in 2000, Iraq and Libya. But so in 2002, Russia voted the United Nations to give the United States the power to impose a no-fly zone on Iraq, and or to punish Iraq in some form. The United States, a few months later, staged a full-scale invasion of Iraq. That was not what the United Nations had agreed on. There was resolution 1441, but it never prescribed a full-scale invasion. And then, by the way, in 2008, in 2008, there was a war in Georgia that many people blame on Georgia, not on Russia. The United States, of course, sided with Georgia. Now, the other one was 2011. 2011, and this apparently has been a major trauma for Putin personally. In 2011, Russia approved the United Nations a resolution to impose a no-fly zone over Libya while the Libyans were protesting against Gaddafi. The United States promised not to bomb Libya. Sure enough, a few weeks later, NATO was bombing Libya, and Gaddafi was murdered. Russia never authorized this. In between, there was also Serbia. United States bombed Serbia and took Kosovo out of Serbia. And again, the Russians were ignored. So there's no question that that the United States has cheated, has taken advantage also of Russia. Now, whatever the story, does that mean that Ukraine should comply with the agreements reached in 1990 with the West? No, I don't think so. Why? Because Ukraine and the Ukrainian people were not consulted. In 1990, the discussions were about German reunification. Whatever the Western diplomats and the Russian diplomats discussed, it was not approved by the Ukrainian people. You cannot treat the Ukrainians like some disposable entity. They're human beings, and so nobody asked the Ukrainian parliament to approve the statement that Ukraine should never join NATO. Same with Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Czech, Hungary, and so on. I mean, whatever the diplomats of the West and Russia discussed over the heads of these people is null and void. So whatever NATO and Russia negotiated directly is not binding for the people who were, for the other countries that were affected. The only referendum granted to the Ukrainian people at the time was a referendum about seceding from the Soviet Union. I believe it was December 1991. They overwhelmingly voted yes, but that referendum didn't say, oh, by the way, are you willing to renounce forever the right to join the European Union and NATO? Nobody asked them. So imagine if France and Brazil negotiated the future of Sri Lanka. I mean, would that imply that the people of Sri Lanka must obey what France and Brazil negotiated for them? That's senseless. So the Russians are right to feel that the US didn't keep its promises, but the Ukrainians are also right to ignore whatever promises were made about their country without consulting them. Now the claim, so Putin also claims that the West uses a double standard when it judges Russia's actions. Of course, that is true. I mean, the obvious case is when in 1999 NATO bombed Serbia, which used to be a satellite of the Soviet Union. Slavic brothers of the Russians. Serbia had not attacked any NATO country, so there was no legal justification for NATO to attack Serbia. yes, it was done for humanitarian reasons, whatever, but in many other cases, NATO didn't bomb a country to protect to protect people. NATO did not bomb Rwanda to stop the genocide there. Did not even bomb Saddam Hussein when he attacked, I think it was the Kurds, and killing tens of thousands of them. So not only that, but NATO even extracted a piece of Serbia, Kosovo, and declared it independent. And when Russia carries out similar actions in Georgia, Ukraine, or wherever, then the West is outraged. Another example of double standard, of course, is Catalonia itself. I mean, Catalonia, there were mass demonstrations in favor of Catalonia's independence. And what was the reaction of NATO member Spain? Well, Spain arrested the leaders of the independent movement, and never granted a referendum. So there is obviously double standard in the way we judge Russia. When Russia does these things, they become crimes against humankind, atrocities, and so on. And I should add that there's another aspect. It's not only the double standard, but also I think Russians also see the West as incompetent, increasingly so. Wherever NATO goes, it creates problems. And Iraq, of course, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the spectacular demonstrations. In all three cases, from the point of view of Russia, that NATO intervention simply created a massive chaos. So there is some truth in what Putin and the Russians in general believe. Putin claims that this invasion of Ukraine is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. So that doesn't sound like the real reason. It's probably one of the reasons, but not the immediate important reason. There was no chance of Ukraine being accepted by NATO. Yes, the Ukrainian government has often spoken of joining NATO, in particular this president, Zelensky. But in June 2021, Zelensky met with NATO's Secretary General, Jens, I can pronounce his last name, Stoltenberg, and NATO's General Secretary gave him zero chances of joining NATO. In September 2021, Zelensky met with the US President, Joe Biden, and he got the same assurance that Ukraine would not be admitted in NATO anytime soon. Yes, NATO always says, well, maybe someday. Well, that means nothing. So in my opinion, NATO was not prepared to have Ukraine as a member anytime soon. And even joining the European Union was very difficult before this war. After this war, but before this war, it was very difficult because Ukraine just isn't a stable democracy. Rampant corruption is a major problem. Right? And the mood in the European Union after Brexit, after COVID, very few people would like an enlargement. So that was very unlikely. At the same time, Putin might be evil, but he's not stupid. Putin must have known that attacking Ukraine, the fact that he attacked Ukraine, that would increase NATO presence. So it is Putin's invasion of Ukraine that may lead to an increased presence of NATO at the border with Russia. And it might even lead to a new expansion of NATO, because two countries that got alarmed are Sweden and Finland. Sweden owns a little island in the Baltic that is strategic, and Russia could take it any day. There's no way that Sweden's military could stop a Russian invasion of that island. And Finland Finland borders Russia, just like Ukraine. So that reason, I don't think this reason is the main reason that Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, Putin claims that NATO has deployed missiles near Russia, whereas Russia never did anything like that. Putin always says, how would the United States react if we put missiles in Canada and Mexico? So that's not really, that's bogus argument. There's a difference. So first of all, there's a difference between defensive missiles and offensive missiles. The defensive missiles have to be placed in the place that they defend. So the defensive missiles in the Baltic have to be in the Baltic, as close as possible to Russian border. Those are the missiles that Putin doesn't like. The offensive missiles can be placed anywhere, unfortunately. In the age of long-range missiles, they can be placed everywhere. In a few minutes, a missile can launch from somewhere in Russia and hit California. It doesn't make any difference whether it's deployed near the border or not. In fact, when did Russia invade Syria? 2015-16. It was big news in Eastern Europe that Russia struck Syria with missiles launched from the Caspian Sea. Right? Russia does not need to deploy missiles near Eastern European countries to be sure to hit them. Anyway, the list of Russian missiles located near NATO countries is infinite. So in 2015 and 2016, so let's go back. First of all, the distance between Russia and Alaska is 82 kilometers as the missile flies. There are Russian missiles in a small military base in the far east of Russia. There are missiles in the Kamchatka Peninsula, at least since 2015. Kaliningrad, that is the small Russian enclave near Poland. So in 2016, the Russians deployed the Bastion missiles capable of firing supersonic cruise missiles with a range of 500 kilometers. In 2017, deployed a new kind of missile, the 9M729. That was in violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. In 2018, the nuclear-capable Iskander missiles, probably the most feared missiles in Eastern Europe. Now, in talking about that treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, in 2005, Putin correctly criticized that treaty because it was limited to Russia and the United States. And he was right. In fact, China and North Korea developed those kind of missiles because they're outside the treaty. Well, eventually, Putin accuses the West of cheating on that treaty. I think Russia cheated first, but in any case, 3 years ago, Russia and the United States both withdrew from this treaty. So that's also bogus that it's the United States that violated the treaty. NATO has deployed very little in Eastern Europe. I could go over the story that started with Obama. NATO deployed almost nothing before Obama, was going to deploy something during the Obama years. It didn't, and it didn't under Trump. So in 2019, Poland asked the United States, Donald Trump, for a permanent US military base, but that doesn't exist yet. Ironically, the only powerful missiles, cruise missiles, that exist in Eastern Europe are not from NATO. Last year, Estonia purchased from Israel. The company is called, don't remember, purchased the Blue Spear cruise missiles. Now, in the Far East, incidentally, Russia also has missiles on the Kuril Islands, the islands claimed by Japan. By the way, I think there never was a peace treaty between Russia and Japan precisely because of those islands whose status is not decided. Well, Russia not only militarized them, but has deployed all sorts of missiles, including the Bastion missiles I mentioned before, the S-300V4 missiles, all of this between 2016 and last year. Last year also the S-400 missiles in the island of Sakhalin. How many missiles has Japan deployed during these years? It's nothing. So Russia is guilty of what it accuses NATO of doing. They both did this. Okay. What should be the relationship between Europe and Russia? I don't know, but there are fundamental problems that make it difficult, and unfortunately, I don't think it's easy to solve this problem. The fundamental conceptual problems. So let's start with the problem I call the mother of all problems in Europe. Russia views Europe as a hostage, not as a partner, not as a neighbor. It's a hostage. Russia thinks, probably correctly, that the main condition of its own security is that Europe be insecure. In other words, if the United States attacks Russia anywhere in the world, well, they can both blow up each other and the entire planet, or the United States wins, unless Russia can retaliate against Europe. So Russia is holding Europe hostage, basically. Russia wants the fundamental right to destroy Europe with its nuclear weapons or its conventional army, but it wants that right. So I keep saying Russia is a bigger version of North Korea. North Korea holds South Korea and Japan hostages so that the United States cannot attack North Korea. And a similar principle is at work in Europe. Russia holds European hostage. There was a sort of missile crisis. Remember the Cuba crisis, 1962? Well, there was a similar, smaller version of that missile crisis in 2008, a few months after Russia invaded Georgia. The United States announced the intention of building missile defenses in Poland and Czechia. Russia reacted like it had been attacked. The reaction was so furious that 1 year later, Obama canceled the plan, despite the fact that Russia was Russia's military buildup in Kaliningrad next door. But the reaction from Russia was so furious, like it had been attacked. So that's emblematic. Now, the other cause, I said there's a few fundamental problems. Another one, so a source of insecurity for Russia is very simple. Nobody wants to be ruled by Russia, especially by Putin's Russia. Just like nobody wanted to be ruled by the Soviet Union. That we can discuss forever why that is the case, but that is the case. Nobody has tried to invade Russian territory, just like nobody tried to invade the Soviet Union. The reason the Soviet Union disintegrated and the reason Russia keeps losing friends is that people just don't like to be ruled by Russia. Nobody stole Estonia, Georgia, or Kazakhstan from Russia. It's those people who didn't want to be ruled by Russia. It is false that the United States engineered the democratization of Poland or Romania. Certainly welcome it, certainly helped them. But fundamentally, the Polish, the Romanians, and so on got rid of communism by themselves. And they saw Russians as the oppressor. So Russia's problem is that none of its neighbors is excited to have Russian interference in any way. That's a big difference with the United States. You know, Europeans and Japanese may have their own problems with the United States, but they tolerate and sometimes welcome the interference of the United States. So that I don't know how to change that problem. Russia will keep feeling isolated as long as people don't like to have Russian interference and certainly don't like to be ruled by Russia. Third fundamental problem, very simple. Western Europe was richer than Eastern Europe, and the European Union now is richer than Russia. And of course, that's embarrassing. That's ultimately that's a failure by Russia. So in this case, Russia's Putin's real concern probably was not NATO expansion. Putin's real concern was that Ukraine was on the way to becoming a prosperous and free country. And that is a big problem, especially in a country like Ukraine, which is not only a neighbor, but half of its population speaks Russian. The worst publicity for Putin at home is the fact that ethnic Russians who live in Lithuania and Estonia, which is, I think it's about 1/3 of the population in each of these two Baltic countries. These ethnic Russians are richer than the Russians who live inside Russia. GDP per capita in Lithuania is about $20,000. GDP per capita, same in Estonia, maybe in Estonia a little more. GDP per capita in Russia is $10,000. The last thing that Putin wants to see is that ethnic Russians in Ukraine also get richer than the Russians across the border in Russia, inside Russia. And so this is not a fundamental problem that I don't know to change, but it will remain a problem because, of course, any money talks. People tend to move closer to the places that are richer. So it will always be a force that tends to move people west. Today, Ukraine, tomorrow, Belarus, day after what? So the contagion can spread inside Russia. If it gets away with it, if Russia conquers the whole of Ukraine and the border is now with Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and so on, that will be a problem for Eastern Europe because the same logic will apply. Putin would then have the problem that the people of Ukraine see the Polish and the Romanians get richer and freer. So that tension will remain there. So talking about relations between Europe and Russia. So the COVID crisis Europe woke up to the fact, during the COVID crisis, Europe woke up to the fact that Europe depends on China on so many things, including face masks. So many supplies depend on China. But if China has its own crisis, then Europe cannot get those supplies. This invasion of Ukraine is useful for Europe to wake up to the fact, obvious fact, well-known fact, that Europe depends on Russia's oil and gas for its energy needs. This has been known for a while, but somehow, European politicians and European voters, ultimately, have blatantly ignored this fact. And I have written that the anti-nuclear movement in Europe is Putin's best ally in Europe, because if you don't have oil, you don't have gas, you don't want to use coal, and solar and wind will take decades to develop to a point that you are self-sufficient with those sources of energy, well, nuclear is the way to go. You build nuclear power plants and you control your own future. So anyway, it's hopefully Europeans are waking up to this fact. Europeans are also waking up to the fact, very simple fact, that Russia is a small economy. It's as big as Italy, probably much smaller now. And still, it is a military superpower. How can it afford that? Well, it's money that comes from Europe. Europeans buy gas and oil from Russia, so Russia gets a lot of money that it can spend in weapons. I don't know what Russia would do if it became a cash-starved country, but I don't think it could field so many soldiers with so many tanks and invade Ukraine. So anyway, do you think, like Biden, that the direct confrontation between NATO and Russia would mean World War III? Well, I don't know if Biden thought carefully about what he was saying. A war in Europe between Russia and its neighbors, it's a European war. At best, it would be comparable to the war on Crimea of 1853. When he says world war, that's scary because he assumes that China enters the conflict. World War II was a world war, became a world war when Japan attacked the United States, when Japan attacked the French, Dutch, British colonies. So because Japan entered the war, without Japan, I'm not sure it would have been such a world war. Yes, North Africa, but still, it's the fact that Japan was there that really made it a world war. So World War III really implies China entered the conflict. And which other country is likely to side on Russia's side? So that's I hope that's unlikely for a number of reasons. First of all, there is no defense pact between China and Russia like there was between Germany and Japan and Italy. Second, I really fail to see what China gains for such a war. It would be such a devastating war, and it would actually probably make it more difficult for China to get Taiwan, because at that point, if you are at war with the United States, why should the United States let you invade Taiwan? I just feel it's really far-fetched that it would become a world war. Nonetheless, it is scary if NATO fights Russia in Europe or anywhere else. I mean, there are 1,000 nuclear bombs in the world. What do you think of the timing of the invasion? Yeah, that's everybody's guess. So first of all, I can see 3 or 4 elements here. So first of all, in 2021, Putin lost two key allies. The first one is Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump lost the election badly, but he kept claiming there was fraud. I'm still going to find a way to become president. Eventually, in 2021, Putin realized this was not going to happen. Now, I'm pretty sure that Trump worked for Putin, and we can discuss forever if it was collusion or it was just Trump likes Putin or whatever. But pretty much everything Trump did was to defend Putin, weaken NATO, weaken the European Union, weaken the United States, weaken his own party, the Republican Party. Yeah, this was, Putin could not have achieved more with all of his secret services and all of his actions in Europe. So Trump was a major asset for Putin, and he disappeared in 2021. He fulfilled his mission. His mission was to weaken NATO. He did. Don't trust me. There's Bolton worked for Putin. Bolton, you can see the recent interview where Bolton says, I'm convinced Trump was going to pull out of NATO if he had been re-elected. So that's one key ally that Putin lost, major one. The other one, not very famous, but is the, let's see, Medvedchuk, probably mispronounce it, is an oligarch of Ukraine, one of the oligarchs, the main oligarch, the main pro-Russia oligarch of Ukraine. In May 2021, Ukraine arrested him. He was the leader of the pro-Russian party, and he was the owner of, I believe, 3 TV stations, all of them pro-Russia. If Putin installs a puppet regime in Ukraine, these oligarchs very likely to be the head of state. So this man, by the way, I believe Putin was also the godfather of his daughter, something like that. So they're friends, very good friends. And in May 2021, this man lost all of his power in Ukraine. Now, that's after these 2 events, Russia started preparing for the invasion. Another factor that probably had an influence is the retirement of Angela Merkel. Merkel, to me, she was a colossus of European diplomacy, but in particular, she speaks Russian. She grew up in East Germany when it was communist, and Putin was deployed in East Germany as a spy, and Putin speaks German. So I think he had a personal connection with Merkel, although they probably disliked each other. But in a sense, Putin trusted Merkel in a way that he doesn't trust anybody else. And maybe Putin also underestimated Merkel's successor, Olaf Scholz. Putin probably thought that Scholz is weak. He also leads a coalition full of pacifists, the Greens and so on. So I think that was another factor. The withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan has been mentioned as a possible trigger. If that is the case, then Putin miscalculated, because when the United States pulls out of both Iraq and Afghanistan, de facto Syria, Libya, the United States is just not involved in the Islamic world anymore, well, then it has more time for Europe. So from that point of view, if he thought that the United States pulls out of Afghanistan in such a horrible way, pathetic way, he thinks that means the United States is unlikely to pay attention. That's a big miscalculation. The United States now has no distraction in the Islamic world. And then, and then maybe the COVID was a factor because Putin probably saw Europe as exhausted from COVID, unwilling to add another economic crisis after COVID. And Putin has a big COVID problem at home. I personally think Russia has been the most devastated country. As a percentage of population, Russia probably lost a huge percentage of people, and COVID is still spreading like wildfire. So COVID may have been also. So the timing, of course, everybody has a favorite explanation of why now. But to me, the real mystery is why the United States were so sure. See, the Russians kept saying, no, we are not going to invade Ukraine. No, we are not going to invade Ukraine. They said it over and over again. And the United States kept repeating, no, they are invading Ukraine. They have the plan. The United States even pinpointed the specific week. So I'm really puzzled by the fact that the United States were so sure that they knew exactly what Putin had decided. That, in my opinion, deserves a few minutes of thinking. Number one, the CIA is so good that they intercepted Putin's calls and so on. Well, given the CIA's blunder on the weapons of mass destruction, the pull out from Afghanistan, hard to believe. Number two, there are spies in the Kremlin that talk with Putin and then run outside and call the United States and tell them. In a hard to believe. In a Putin's Kremlin, hard to believe. The third one is that Putin told somebody outside of Russia, and that somebody told the United States. And before this invasion, the only person Putin spoke to was the president of China. As the only person that Putin could have warned, briefed on what he was going to do. So it's kind of, I've speculated that maybe Putin told Xi and she called Biden actually. Otherwise, I would like a rational explanation about how the United States was so sure what was going to happen. Okay, now talking speculations, a lot of speculation that Putin lost his mind. I think this speculation started in 2014 when Merkel, maybe she didn't meet in person, maybe she had just a phone call, but she was so shocked by what Putin told her that she told Obama that Putin lives in another world. And then we've had meetings between, well, at least the meetings with Macron and the Finnish president, and they both describe Putin as increasingly paranoid. And then there are these images of Putin sitting at this very long table, not only with Macron, but with his own generals, his own, the closest associates, and always this huge distance between him and the others. Is he afraid of COVID? Is he afraid of being assassinated? We have this image of an increasingly isolated man in his palaces and in his dacha. It's hard to tell. But, and by the way, there are rumors that he keeps watching and rewatching the video of the assassination of Gaddafi. Now, the NATO expansion, I don't think it's a rational justification of what it did. He was afraid that NATO would expand, despite the fact that NATO told Ukraine, no way. Biden told Ukraine, no way. It just sounds so unlikely. But one thing that was happening, it has happened, and it keeps happening, is the color revolutions. The color revolution, the revolutions that depose former, the dictators of former Soviet republics. And we keep ignoring the fact that Ukraine was not without a precedent. 1 month before he invaded Ukraine, he de facto invaded Kazakhstan to save the dictator of Kazakhstan from popular demonstrations, and invaded Belarus to support Lukashenko, who was also the object of popular demonstrations. So actually, Putin did more than just Ukraine. He did Kazakhstan, Belarus, and then Ukraine. It feels maybe he's just trying to stop these color revolutions. They're getting too close to his own palace. Maybe the invasion of Ukraine is simply about his own survival. After all, think of all the people. I mean, first of all, if he falls, he has nowhere to go. He really risks big time. If he falls, he could be in prison, killed. He could end up like Gaddafi. He could be arrested and tried for crimes against humankind. He has no place to go. Where does he go? China? And think of the people around him. Politicians, generals, and oligarchs. Putin is not immortal. These people may be willing to wait until he leaves, retires, or he dies. But years go by. Nobody's getting younger. So all these politicians, generals, and oligarchs, some of them might be getting a little tired of Putin, and some of them might be interested to replace him with someone younger and less paranoid. Putin is a product of the Cold War. He blames the United States, NATO, with being stuck in the mood of the Cold War. But he was raised in the Cold War, and he very much embodies the spirit of the Cold War. So there might be younger people who actually didn't grow up in that mindset, and they're looking forward for a change in everything that represents the world of the Cold War. Okay, I need to drink. So the response of the West so far. So a few comments. I mean, militarily, I have no idea what will happen. But the first one is that every major war has introduced a new kind of weapon, right? So the US Civil War, the machine gun in this US Civil War, the airplane in World War I, the atomic bomb in World War II, drones in the Islamic wars of the United States, and cyber warfare actually was introduced by Russia in the Georgia War of 2008. So this war, in my opinion, has introduced a new weapon. I call it econocide, the global sanctions on a scale never seen before. Econocide because it's the equivalent of genocide, except it's not about people. It's not about killing people, but killing an economy, an entire economy. This has been done before in history, but I don't think the effects were so immediate, drastic. I mean, the sanctions against Mussolini did nothing. Most Italians didn't even know there were sanctions against Mussolini. The sanctions against Iran, yeah, They've done something, but not much. But what has been done to Russia, in my opinion, is more. So I call it a colonized. Second comment on the response of the West, there's one thing I don't like, is the cultural war against Russia. That's silly. First of all, let me say up front, I'm a big fan of Russian literature. The 19th century, I think Russia had the greatest writers of the time. Russia has had great artists, great musicians. Just silly to forget all of that. The cultural war is wrong, period. The Metropolitan Opera canceled the engagement of Russian soprano, what's her name, Anna Netrebko. Ireland canceled the performance by the Royal Moscow Ballet. Britain canceled the performance of the Russian State Ballet. Which, by the way, these ballets, I don't know if this one, the Bolshevik, but these ballets include the dancers who are not only Russians. An Italian university has suspended a course on Dostoevsky. Italy's famous opera theater, La Scala, has fired a Russian conductor. Eurovision, FIFA, the Paralympic Games have banned Russian singers, soccer players, and even disabled athletes. McDonald's, Starbucks, and Coca-Cola suspend operations in Russia. Probably forgetting some. Oh, Disney and Warner Brothers are not showing their movies in Russian theaters. This is getting ridiculous. Just ridiculous. By the way, we are forgetting the other victims of this war, the Russian people themselves. I don't see why we should make it even a war against the whole Russian civilization. This is ridiculous. This is Putin. This is not about Russia or the Russian civilization of the Russian people. Another comment on the Western response. Here I'm making a prediction, which is always dangerous. But there are all the enemies that suddenly may look like opportunities to the United States. Iran and Venezuela. We forget why Russian oil has become so precious, so important. Well, because there are sanctions against Iran and Venezuela, that together they have huge, immense oil reserves. If the United States reaches some kind of agreement with Iran and Venezuela, Russian oil, well, first of all, the price of oil goes down, which means Russia loses money. But second, the importance of Russia as an oil producer is greatly diminished. I suspect that will soon be part of Russia, of the West's response to the invasion. What do you think of China? So China is always the most difficult to decipher. The problem with China, for us, is that China thinks long-term, unlike us. The West thinks short-term. Russia thinks long-term. So it's hard to understand. And on one hand, it sounds like China knew exactly what Putin was going to do. On the other hand, before the invasion, China kept accusing the United States of creating panic over nothing, as if China did not know that the United States was right. Putin was about to invade. Now the Chinese media are the only media in the world that are faithfully rebroadcasting Russian propaganda. Whatever. if I look at the costs and benefits, there are costs for the West. There are obvious costs for Russia. I don't see the cost for China. China is benefiting from this crisis because Russia has to sell oil and gas to China. In fact, Russia has to sell all natural resources to China. And of course, China, the Chinese are the best businessmen, possibly after the Arabs. The Chinese will pay as little as possible for it. So right now, the trajectory is that Russia is going to become a client state of China. The day that Siberia will speak Chinese is closer than ever. Whatever the conclusion of this war, Russia will be poorer, weaker, and lonelier. Russia will never be a rival again to China in Central Asia or anywhere in Asia. Eastern Russia itself will gradually fall under the Chinese sphere of influence. So I started wondering if Xi's real goal, if China's real long-term goal is not Taiwan, but Siberia. Imagine China with the vast natural resources of Siberia. They say China is the closest ally that Russia has. Well, good luck. Putin sold weapons to India and Vietnam, two countries with which China fought wars. It showed to China that Russia is as unreliable as the US as a friend. By the way, Russia sold India missiles that clearly India will use will aim at China. Russia knew this. I mean, everybody knew this. So the Chinese think long term. The US fears, the United States, the West fears a China-Russia alliance. I suspect that China fears that in the long run, there will be a West-Russian alliance against China. Why? Putin is not immortal. The anti-European, anti-Russian sentiments are relics of the Cold War in which Putin grew up. Same thing I just said. Well, whoever comes after Putin, that will be probably a younger person, and maybe Russia will move closer to the West. All the conflicts will be solved. After all, these are very silly conflicts. I mean, there's no reason why Russia and Europe could not coexist peacefully. And if that happens, then you have an alliance West Russia against China. So, it's not clear what China, where China's interest is, and what China's real thinking is. What do you see? How do you see this war from a historical point of view? So, if you look from the point of view of centuries of history, as I said, it's not only Ukraine. Russia invaded Kazakhstan and Belarus before Ukraine. I see a continuity. We've always seen that this continuity of 1917. First, there is Tsarist Russia, Russian Empire, and then there is the Soviet Union. Then 1991, there's another discontinuity. The Soviet Union collapses, and there is Russia, which Putin's Russia now. I see a continuity between Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union and today's Russia. Sometimes I call it neo-fascist Russia. Putin, to me, is a neo-fascist. The Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 for reasons very similar to Putin's current reasons to invade Ukraine. Right? Those two countries were moving close to the West, and the justification was also their brothers, their comrades. what we are finding out is that the conflict between Western Europe and Russia was not ideological. It remains. You change the ideology, we still have the conflict. So with or without communism, there is a problem. There is a problem there. There is a chronic problem in Europe. There is one notable difference, of course, between the Soviet Union and Russia. The Soviet Union was the second largest economy in the world, whereas Russia's economy is smaller than Italy. The Soviet Union and Putin's Russia seem to be very different from Tsarist Russia, from the Russian Empire of the past. But they're actually very similar in that Russia is still a colonial empire. See, okay, let's go back in time. There were European colonial empires. The Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the smaller ones, Italian, German, so on. Russia was one of them. Austrian Empire. Some of them were spread all over the world. Some of them were land empires. So the Austrian Empire was mostly a land empire, at one point stretching from Spain to the Balkans. Russia was a colonial empire. It started from Kiev, Moscow, and then it expanded. It kept invading lands east and west. So these were the colonial empires. Now, the Spanish Empire was the first one to go. In the 19th century, it imploded, and all these countries in Latin America were created. The Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire disintegrated after World War I. They lost World War I, and the consequence was Austria now is a small country. Turkey is the country that used to be the main country of the main part of the Ottoman Empire. North Africa, Middle East became independent, first they became French, British colonies, now they're independent. Austrian Empire disintegrated, and you have all these new countries in Eastern Europe. The Dutch Empire disintegrated, Indonesia was born. So this is after World War II. The British Empire disintegrated, now you have all these new countries in Africa, South Asia. French Empire disintegrated, now you have Algeria, Vietnam, Madagascar, independent. The Russian Empire is still there. The Russian Empire did some magic in 1917 to rebrand itself as the Soviet Union. And then in 1991, did another magic, some more magic, to rebrand itself as a democratic Russia. But it's still there. So that could be the source of the chronic problem. See, when a Russian politician defends the right of Russia to resist, to exist as it is, it's like an Austrian politician defending the right of the Austrian Empire to reform. It's like a British nationalist defending the right of the British Empire to exist again. The age of the colonial empires is gone. It's unthinkable that Britain again will become the ruler of Canada and the United States. Russia is the only colonial empire, European colonial empire left. I'm sure there was good things about these empires. I'm sure all empires did something good, and some countries were probably better off when there were colonies of the British or the French than after independence. But the colonial empire in the 21st century may not make much sense anymore. Putin claims that Ukraine makes no sense, but maybe it's Russia that doesn't make sense anymore. And I'm trying to use words that will not offend the Russians. And I feel like somebody was telling, in 1949, is telling the British Empire doesn't make sense anymore, trying not to offend the feelings of British citizens. What worries you most about this war? I don't know yet what should worry us. We don't know how far this will go. One thing that worries me in general is a recurring message that we are sending out. A nuclear power, again, has invaded a country that gave up weapons of mass destruction. Ukraine had nuclear weapons in 1991 and voluntarily surrendered the weapons of mass destruction. And 20 years later, it gets invaded by nuclear power. The United States invaded Iraq because Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. The United States has never invaded North Korea because North Korea has weapons of mass destruction. Gaddafi was killed after he gave up weapons of mass destruction. China threatens Taiwan because Taiwan gave up its nuclear program in the 60s. So you look around and you keep finding a very simple rule. If you have nuclear bombs, they will not invade you. If you don't have nuclear weapons, they might. So that's what worries me. That's the message we're sending out. And I wonder how many times this theorem needs to be proven before just about everybody starts building nuclear weapons. Okay, that's it. Thank you.